Hi, this is Ultimate 156. I'm going to demonstrate how everyone used to take pictures. With a certain type of camera that was once very popular. Maybe some of you had one of these. It's called a 35mm single lens reflex camera. 35mm SLR for short. The model which I'm going to be demonstrating is perhaps the best-selling 35mm single lens reflex camera ever, the Pentax K1000. Unlike today's cameras, which are automatic everything, it was manual everything. And yes, it used something called film in which you recorded the pictures. It didn't have a CCD sensor. And if the battery gave out on the camera, you might have lost the light meter. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't work. But the shutter still worked. And of course you could still adjust the aperture, and you just had to use your experience to get the exposure. Well, here it is. Yes, this is all too familiar to probably many people who used to take pictures. The Pentax K1000, this example is from 1987. Yes, it actually still works! Believe it or not. And I'll show you the controls right here. This is the wind lever. And there's the shutter speed control. Now, for a slower shutter speed, a longer exposure, you set it to lower numbers. For a faster shutter speed, you set it to higher numbers. Now this here is your film rewind. Also, it opens the back, as I will demonstrate right here. Okay, that's the back of the camera. The roll of film, or actually cassette, goes into this compartment. When you put it in, you put this down, and then you close the back of the camera. And then here's the lens. Now you have settings here. That's your aperture. Right now, I have this set to f5.6. f1.4 for this particular lens. And that means a very wide lens opening, so you could shoot pictures in very low light. Now I will turn it the other way, and it will go to f22, a higher number but a smaller lens opening. So use that in very bright light. Now there's an A setting on here. That means it could be used on a camera with automatic aperture control. Automatic shutter control. So that means, wait a minute. Okay, I'm a little confused. Wait a minute. Okay, my first thing. Automatic aperture control. So you set the shutter speed and the camera would set the aperture. Also, it was also for use on cameras that had full program that the electronics would set the shutter speed and the aperture. In the Pentax line, the cameras that had a full program were the Pentax Super Program, Super A overseas, Program A, overseas Program Plus in the United States, the A3000. I think that was the United States, and the A3 overseas, and later models too. The models I mentioned were all manual focus, as this camera is. But of course the A function would not work on this camera. And this is the focusing ring. Now, many of you remember that when you bought a 35mm camera, it came with something called the standard lens. This is a 50mm lens. And of course, the advice of the manufacturer was probably all of them, was that you stick with the 50mm lens until you were familiar with the effects of, let's say, a shorter focal length lens, which was called a wide angle lens, or a longer focal length lens, which is called a telephoto lens, but also a variable focal length lens, which we call a zoom lens. Now here's some other controls on the top. Now here, this is your hot shoe for an electronic flash. And then you have to set the shutter to X synchronization. And yet I have it set to X synchronization. Now, this is your shutter release. Now I can change the lens on this particular camera as with just about any other 35mm SLR. I'm going to take this lens off. And now I've put on a 28 to 200 millimeter zoom lens. Zoom out, zoom in. And that was one of the nice things with the 35mm SLR. You could change the lenses when you needed to, provided that you had additional lenses. This ends my initial demonstration of the Pentax K1000 35mm SLR camera. Oops, I had a little bit of a mishap here, but nothing serious. Now I'm going to demonstrate how you load the Pentax K1000 35mm SLR. You open the back. You put the cassette in here. You put the film in the take-up spool. You make sure the film is lined up with the sprockets. Close the back. Make sure it's the rewind knob is tensioned. Advance the film till the shutter's cocked. Shoot once. Shoot twice. And then advance the film again until the exposure indicator is at 1. Now you're ready to take pictures. Once you're finished taking pictures, you are ready to unload the camera. With this camera, and probably most others, there's a button you press on the bottom of the camera. Then you open up the rewind crank. You hold down the rewind button while you wind up the film. You keep doing this until there okay, you hear a sound that the film is off the take-up spool. Then it's safe to open up the camera. And you remove the cassette. If you want to shoot more pictures, you put in a fresh cassette. Also, the other thing with this camera, unlike most cameras probably made starting in the mid-1980s, you set the film speed manually, and I'm going to show you how you do that. On the shutter speed dial on this particular model of camera, there's an outer knob which you lift up and you can change the film speed. Right now I have it set to actually ISO 800. Now if it was a slower speed film, as that one was, I turned it counterclockwise distance and I set it for 200. The film speed range for this particular model is ISO 20 to ISO 3200. Well, that ends my demonstration upon my Pentax K1000 camera. Yes, and it is a 35mm SLR, as I mentioned earlier, and it is all manual and it used film. Oh yes, you can still get film if you do try real hard. And of course, here's another thing with film. You had to send it to a processor, to be developed, and then any pictures that were printable were printed. And of course, there were other types of film. Now, of course, a lot of people were used to color print film. Some of you probably remember black and white film. Maybe years ago you were in a photography class that you wanted to use a fast black and white film that was called Kodak Tri-X. And then, of course, there was the regular speed film that was Kodak Plus X. Now, Tri-X was rated ISO 400, Plus X ISO 125. Now, up until sometime in the 1980s, there was a slow black and white film called Pentax X, ISO 32. I never used that film, but I'm sure some of you had. And of course, there are other types of film. Of course, probably some of you remember Kodachrome. Of course, I used that a number of times. And of course, the last roll of Kodachrome I ran through that particular camera was of the blazing speed of ISO 64. Of course, faster slide films were available. There was once an ISO 200 speed Kodachrome. And of course, probably a lot of you remember Ektachrome, which later became Elite Chrome. And of course, there is still, I guess, Fujichrome, unless that's been discontinued. And of course, remember slideshows? Those are probably largely gone at this point. And of course, there was the carousel slide projector that was discontinued about 10 years ago next month. And of course, you probably remember those if you had one. So this is just an additional feature that I'm explaining to you of what it was like to have a film camera. Well, of course, those are gone, and now we have digital cameras. Or let's say just about everyone has digital cameras, and now, of course, you'll load the pictures onto your computer, then any that you want to print, you print. With your printer, if it is able to print photos, which probably most inkjet printers can these days, or if you happen to have an older compact HP photo printer, which was designed for that. They haven't made those for a few years now. Those compact photo printers, I had one that I really liked until it wouldn't work with my computer. Well, that's all, folks.